Happy morning, children. In today's class, we are going to continue the lesson Forest and Wildlife Resources from Geography. In the last class, we have seen the first half of the lesson, and today we'll see the remaining. Conservation of forest and wildlife in India. Conservation in the background of rapid decline in wildlife population and forestry has become essential. But why do we need to conserve our forests and wildlife? Conservation preserves the ecological diversity and our life support systems, water, air, and soil. It also preserves the genetic diversity of plants and animals for better growth of species and breeding. For example, in agriculture, we are still dependent on traditional crop varieties. Fisheries too are heavily dependent on the maintenance of aquatic biodiversity. Here they are saying that conservation of forest and wildlife is very important. You may have a question, why do we need to conserve our forest and wildlife? We need to conserve our forest and wildlife because they preserve the ecological diversity and our life support system, that is water, air and soil. And they also preserve the genetic diversity of plants and animals for better growth of species and breeding. For example, in agriculture, we are still dependent on the traditional crops, so it is very important to preserve the wildlife and the forest. And the forest management departments, they should take care of the substantial growth of the forest and ensure that hunting and poaching activities are avoided. The protection of diverse wildlife in the forest is called wildlife conservation. In the 1960s and 1970s, conservationists demanded a national wildlife protection program. The Indian Wildlife Protection Act was implemented in 1972 with various provisions for protecting habitats. An All India list of protected species was also published. The thrust of the program was towards protecting and remaining population of certain endangered species by banning hunting, giving legal protection to their habitats, and restricting trade in wildlife. Subsequently, central and many state governments established national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, about which you have already studied. As you can see here, in the year 1960s and 1970s, conservationists, they demanded a national wildlife protection program. So in India, they also have announced a program called Indian Wildlife Protection Act, and this was implemented in the year 1972 for protecting the habitats. So an all India list of protected species was also published, and this program was announced for protecting the remaining population of certain endangered species. We have already seen in the last class what are the endangered species. So this program was announced for the protection of endangered species by banning hunting, giving legal protection to their habitats, and restricting trade in wildlife. The central government also announced several projects for protecting specific animals which were gravely threatened, including the tiger, the one-horned rhinoceros, the Kashmir stag or hangul, 3 types of crocodiles, freshwater crocodile, saltwater crocodile, and the gharial, the Asiatic lion, and others. Most recently, the Indian elephant, black buck, the great Indian bustard, and the snow leopard, etc., have been given full or partial legal protection against hunting and trade throughout India. So here we can come to know that the central government also announced several projects for protecting specific animals, so which were greatly threatened, like tiger, the one-horned rhinoceros, the Kashmir stag or hangul, and the 3 types of crocodiles, which includes freshwater crocodile, saltwater crocodile, and the gharial, and other animals like Asiatic lion and others. So most recently, the Indian elephant, black buck or the great Indian bustard, and snow leopard, etc., have been given full or partial legal protection against hunting and trade throughout India. Look at the picture here, children. So this is the picture of rhino in Kaziranga National Park. And this picture here shows deers in Kaziranga National Park. The conservation projects are now focusing on biodiversity rather than on a few of its components. There is now a more intensive search for different conservation measures. Increasingly, even insects are beginning to find a place in conservation planning. In the notification under Wildlife Act of 1980 and 1986, several hundred butterflies, moths, beetles, and one dragonfly have been added to the list of protected species. In 1991, for the first time, plants were also added to the list, starting with 6 species. Here we can see that the conservation projects are now focusing on biodiversity as a whole rather than a few of its components. So we might have seen that conservation projects, they include only animals of few different species, but here it has extended and it has become more intensive, and this is now a more intensive search for different conservation measures. So you can see that even insects are beginning to find a place in conservation planning. So we have also found a place for insect and for conserving the insects. In the notification under Wildlife Act of 1980 and 1986, so several hundreds butterflies, moths, beetles, and one dragonfly have been added to the list of protected species. And in the year 1991, and for the first time, plants were also added to the list, starting with 6 species. So, conservation of insects and plants were also added to the conservation planning. Project Tiger. Tiger is one of the key wildlife species in the faunal web. In 1973, the authorities realized that the tiger population had dwindled to 1,827 from an estimated 55,000 at the turn of the century. The major threats to tiger population are numerous, such as poaching for trade, shrinking habitat, depletion of prey-based species, growing human population, etc. The trade of tiger skins and the use of their bones in traditional medicines, especially in the Asian countries, left the tiger population on the verge of extinction. So this Project Tiger is a tiger conservation program launched in April 1973 by the Government of India, and this project aims at conserving the population of Bengal tigers, protecting them from extinction. And the major threats to tiger population are numerous, such as poaching. What do you mean by poaching? It's illegal shooting or trapping of animals which are forbidden or restricted. So there are numerous threats such as poaching for trade, shrinking habitat, depletion of prey-based species, and growing human population. And especially the trade of tiger skins and the use of their bones in traditional medicines that happened in the ancient countries left the tiger population on the verge of extinction. Since India and Nepal provide habitat to about 2/3 of the surviving tiger population in the world, these two nations became prime targets for poaching and illegal trading. Project Tiger, one of the well-publicized wildlife campaigns in the world, was launched in 1973. Tiger conservation has been viewed not only as an effort to save an endangered species, but with equal importance as a means of preserving biotypes of sizable magnitude. Corbett National Park in Uttarakhand, Sundarbans National Park in West Bengal, Bandhavgarh National Park in Madhya Pradesh, Sariska Wildlife Sanctuary in Rajasthan, Manas Tiger Reserve in Assam, and Periyar Tiger Reserve in Kerala are some of the tiger reserves of India. Next topic, types and distribution of forest and wildlife resources. Even if we want to conserve our vast forest and wildlife resources, it is rather difficult to manage, control and regulate them. In India, much of its forest and wildlife resources are either owned or managed by the government through the forest department or other government departments. Here they are saying that even if you want to conserve a vast forest and wildlife resources, it is very difficult to manage, control and regulate them. So India, much of the forest and wildlife resources are either owned or managed by the government through the forest department or other government departments. So we have forest department for conserving the forest and wildlife resources, and these are classified as reserved forests and protected forest and unclassed forest. So that we'll see next. These are classified under the following categories: reserved forest, protected forest and unclassed forest. First one, reserved forest. More than half of the total forest land has been declared reserved forest. Reserved forests are regarded as the most valuable as far as the conservation of forest and wildlife resources are concerned. So, reserved forests are the most restricted forests and are constituted by the state government on any forest land or wasteland which is the property of the government. And reserve forests are regarded as the most valuable as far as the conservation of forest and wildlife resources are concerned. Here you can see the picture of reserved forest. Next, protected forest. Almost 1/3 of the total forest area is protected forest as declared by the forest department. This forest land are protected from any further depletion. So, protected forest is an area or mass of land notified under the provisions of Indian Forest Act or the State Forest Act having limited degree of protection. And here you can see the picture of protected forest. Next, unclassed forest. These are other forests and wastelands belonging to both government and private individuals and communities. Reserved and protected forests are also referred to as permanent forest estates maintained for the purpose of producing timber and other forest produce and for protective reasons. Madhya Pradesh has the largest area under permanent forest, constituting 75% of its total forest area. So as you can see here, reserved and protected forests, they can be referred as a permanent forest estates, and these are maintained for the purpose of producing timber and other forest produce and for the protective reasons. Madhya Pradesh has the largest area under permanent forest, constituting 75% of its total forest area. Jammu and Kashmir, Andhra Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal and Maharashtra have larger percentages of reserved forest of its total forest area, whereas Bihar, Haryana, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, Odisha and Rajasthan have a bulk of it under protected forest. All northeastern states and parts of Gujarat have a very high percentage of their forests as unclassed forests managed by local communities. Here we can see the classification of states having protected forest, unclassed forest or reserved forest. So if you see Jammu and Kashmir, Andhra Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal and Maharashtra, they have large percentages of reserved forest. And next, Bihar, Haryana, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, Odisha and Rajasthan, they have bulk areas of protected forest. And other northeastern states and parts of Gujarat have a very high percentage of their forest as unclassed forest. Community and conservation. Conservation strategies are not new in our country. We often ignore that in India, forests are also home to some of the traditional communities. In some areas of India, local communities are struggling to conserve these habitats along with government officials, recognizing that only this will secure their own long-term livelihood. So as you can see here, conservation strategies are not new in our country, and we are all familiar that There are few traditional communities who also live in forest areas. So in some areas of India, local communities are struggling to conserve these habitats along with government officials. In Sariska Tiger Reserve, Rajasthan, villagers have fought against mining by citing the Wildlife Protection Act. In many areas, villagers themselves are protecting habitats and explicitly rejecting government involvement. The inhabitants of 5 villages in the Alwar district of Rajasthan have declared 1,200 hectares of forest as the Bairodev Dakov Sanctuary, declaring their own set of rules and regulations which do not allow hunting and or protecting the wildlife against any outside encroachments. In Sariska Tiger Reserve, which is in Rajasthan, their villagers have fought against mining by citing the Wildlife Protection Act. And in many areas, villagers themselves are protecting habitats and explicitly rejecting government involvements. The famous Chipko movement in the Himalayas has not only successfully resisted deforestation in several areas, but has also shown that community afforestation with indigenous species can be enormously successful. Attempts to revive the traditional conservation methods or developing new methods of ecological farming are now widespread. Farmers and citizens groups like the Beach Bacho and Dolan in Terry and Navdanya have shown that adequate levels of diversified crop protection without the use of synthetic chemicals are possible and economically viable. So the famous Chipko movement or Chipko Andolan was a forest conservation movement in India, and it's actually a non-violent ecological movement by rural villagers, especially women in India, and this happened in 1970s, and this aimed at protecting trees and forests. So if you see the meaning of Chipko, Chipko is a Hindi word. Chipko means to hug. So the women, they hug the trees for not letting them to cut. In India, Joint Forest Management (JFM) program furnishes a good example for involving local communities in the management and restoration of degraded forests. The program has been in formal existence since 1988 when the state of Odisha passed the first resolution for joint forest management. JFM depends on the formation of local village institutions that undertake protection activities mostly on degraded forest land managed by the Forest Department. In return, the members of these communities are entitled to intermediary benefits like non-timber forest produces and share in the timber harvested by successful protection. The clear lesson from the dynamics of both environmental destruction and reconstruction in India is that local communities everywhere have to be involved in some kind of natural resource management. So here JFM means Joint Forest Management, and this program furnishes a good example for involving local communities in the management and protection of degraded forests. JFM depends on the formation of local institutions that undertake protection activities mostly on degraded forest land managed by the Forest Department. So mainly village people are the important people who can protect this forest and management. And it's a clear lesson from the dynamics of both environmental destruction and reconstruction in India that the local communities everywhere, they can involve in some kind of natural resource management. But there is still a long way to go before local communities are at the center stage in decision making. Accept only those economic and developmental activities that are people-centric, environment-friendly, and economically rewarding. Sacred groves, a wealth of diverse and rare species. Nature worship is an age old tribal belief based on the premise that all creations of nature have to be protected. Such beliefs have preserved several virgin forests in pristine form called sacred groves, the forests of god and goddesses. These patches of forest or parts of large forests have been left untouched by the local people, and any interference with them is banned. I hope you have heard about the nature worship, and it's actually an age old tribal belief, and this tribal they believe that all creations of nature have to be protected, and such beliefs have preserved several virgin forests in pristine form called sacred groves. So they are considered as the forest of god and goddesses, as the forest or the creation of god and goddesses. And these patches of forest or some parts of large forest have been left untouched by the local people, and any interference with them is banned. So nobody goes inside the forest or they do not do any harm, and that is banned in those areas. So that's why it is called as sacred groves. Certain societies revere a particular tree which they have preserved from time immemorial. The Mundas and the Santal of Chota Nagpur region worship Moha, and the scientific name for it is Basia latifolia, and Kadamba. And the scientific name for Kadamba is Anthocephalus kadamba trees, and the tribals of Odisha and Bihar worship the tamarind, and the scientific name for tamarind is Tamarindus indica, and mango, and the scientific name for mango is Mangifera indica trees during weddings. To many of us, people and banyan trees are considered sacred. This certain societies they consider these trees as sacred. So particular society they have some particular trees as sacred, and to many of us, people tree and the banyan trees are considered to be sacred. Indian society comprises several cultures, each with its own set of traditional methods of conserving nature and its creations. Sacred qualities are often ascribed to springs, mountain peaks, plants, and animals which are closely protected. You will find troops of macaques and langurs around many temples. They are fed daily and treated as a part of temple devotees. In and around Bishnoi villages in Rajasthan, herds of black buck, nilgai, and peacocks can be seen as an integral part of the community, and nobody harms them. So we all know that India is diverse country where we have different cultures. So Indian society comprises several cultures, each with its own set of traditional methods of conserving nature and its creation. So sacred qualities are often ascribed to springs, mountain peaks, plants, and animals which are closely protected. We can find troops of macaques and langurs around many temples, and they are fed daily and they are treated as a part of temple devotees. In a village called Bishnoi in Rajasthan, we could see herds of blackbuck, nilgai, peacocks, and they are considered as an integral part of their community, and nobody harms them. Okay children, so we have completed the lesson Forest and Wildlife Resources. Have given you the keynotes and worksheet in the PDF format. So kindly see to that and complete your works. Thank you children. We'll see you in the next class and we'll see a new lesson.